So good, so good, so good.
Everything you want for summer is at Nordstrom Rack stores now, and up to 60% off. Stock up and save on the brands you love like Vince, Sam Edelman, Frame, and Free People. Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you Rack.
Most killers are not monsters. That's the part that should frighten you.
You're listening to Unbound Presents Dangerous Minds. Beth Curry talks about whatever the hell she wants. And this time, what she wants to talk about is psychopaths, narcissists, killers, and the people who made them that way. You asked for it, repeatedly. Here's hoping you can handle it.
Hey there, welcome back to Dangerous Minds. I'm Beth Curry. Before we start, I want to say something about how I'm approaching this episode. I think this one is the one where people were probably most curious about when I announced the series, you know, the extreme end, the cases that make the headlines. And I've been careful with my note-taking and research with this one more than the others. Not because the subject is too dark to discuss, but because it's too important to discuss carelessly, I guess. You know, there's a version of this episode that would probably be easy to write and speak and say and tell and whatever. It's the one that lingers on details and catalogs the atrocities and turns real victims into wallpaper for an entertaining story about monsters. I'm not doing that version. I'm doing the forensic version. Okay. The one that asks why and takes the question seriously and tries to give you something useful at the end. If that's not what you came for, that's okay. But it's what I've got. You can go if you don't want to be here for this. I've spent time close to cases involving homicide. Not always in the way you'd imagine. Sometimes it's documents and sometimes it's assessments and sometimes it's sitting in rooms with details that are very specific and very real. And the thing that never leaves you is not the horror, though that's definitely present. It's the ordinariness. Is that even a word? It didn't sound right when I said it. I let that just come out and, well, I guess it's a word. The way, you know, the most extreme acts exist at the end of a chain of completely comprehensible steps. And I don't think it's very comforting, but it's true. And true is where I like to start. I'm going to dismantle the mythology, okay? What we get wrong about killers, because the mythology is not just inaccurate, it is actively counterproductive. It directs our attention towards the wrong things and away from the right ones. The first myth is that killers are obviously different. The research does not support this, kids. Studies of individuals convicted of homicide consistently find that the majority are not identifiably different from the general population in outward presentation. They have families, they have jobs, they have social relationships. They present as normal because by most external measures they are, until they aren't. The cases where there are obvious prior warning signs, and there frequently are. The problem is not that the signs were invisible. The problem is that the systems designed to catch them failed, right? Neighbors who reported concerns that weren't followed up, or mental health contacts that fell through the cracks. Maybe domestic violence histories that weren't taken seriously. The monster mythology is, in a forensic sense, a systems failure dressed up as a question of evil. Okay? Myth 2, killing is always impulsive or always planned. Neither. Figure that one out. The research shows a spectrum. You know, some homicides are profoundly impulsive. You know, that hot reactive aggression we discussed a couple days ago. A single catastrophic moment in which impulse control failed completely. Some are carefully premeditated over extended periods, but most are kind of somewhere in between. You know, they're partially planned, partially opportunistic, but they're both kind of shaped by intent and circumstance. Myth 3, you can tell who's dangerous by looking. No, you can't. Sorry. Risk assessment, the forensic discipline devoted to this question, is a probabilistic exercise, not a predictive one. Okay, so we can identify factors that elevate risk. We cannot identify the individual who will act on that risk with anything approaching certainty. at all. Okay, nothing. Anyone who tells you otherwise is probably trying to sell you something. The obviously dangerous myth is the one that does the most damage, in my view, because it creates this false sense of security. If they were dangerous, we would know. And it directs blame at victims and communities for failing to identify something that forensically was not identifiable in the way we retroactively imagine it was, right? Hindsight's not a risk assessment tool. I want to put that on a sign. Nobody would buy it, but whatever. Homicide is the endpoint of a pathway. So that's the forensic framing, not a spontaneous eruption from nowhere, not an incomprehensible rupture, a pathway with identifiable features that in many cases could theoretically have been interrupted. The majority of homicides globally, consistently across research literature, occur within relationships. Intimate partners, family members, acquaintances. Stranger homicide, the kind that dominates crime fiction, represents a minority of actual homicide cases. Did you know that? Let me know if you knew that. Doesn't make it less serious, but it does mean that if we're genuinely interested in understanding and preventing homicide, we need to be looking at close relationships, not dark strangers. The most significant risk factors for homicide in intimate partner contexts, and this brings us back to part 3, include prior domestic violence, strangulation, access to weapons, explicit threats to kill, the victim's intent to leave the relationship. These factors do not predict homicide with certainty. Okay, they indicate an environment in which homicide becomes significantly more likely. I think the difference between prediction and probability is important, and the forensic field has not always been careful enough about it. Filicide. So this is the killing of a child by a parent. It's statistically one of the most common forms of homicide and one of the least discussed. Research identifies several subtypes. So there's altruistic filicide, where the perp believes they're sparing the child from suffering. There's acutely psychotic filicide. This is occurring in the context of a severe mental health crisis. There's unwanted child filicide, accidental filicide resulting from abuse, and spouse revenge filicide, in which the child is killed to punish the other parent. That last category is the one that most forensic psychologists find the most difficult to sit with, and rightly so. I want to be careful here not to let clinical language do the work of emotional distancing. These are children. These are families. Taxonomy is useful because it helps with understanding and intervention, not because it makes any of it more palatable. It doesn't. It shouldn't. Pop on over to serial killing now. It's defined in most forensic and law enforcement contexts as the killing of 3 or more victims in separate events with a cooling off period between them. The cooling off period is the distinguishable feature, right? It separates serial killing from spree killing and mass murder, and it reflects something important about the psychology involved. The FBI's behavioral science unit, the one that inspired the television show, though the television show took considerable liberties, has been studying serial killers since the 1970s. And the research that emerged from those early interviews and from decades of subsequent study has significantly revised the popular image. Serial killers are not predominantly white men, though white men are overrepresented in American case studies, partly because American case studies have historically overrepresented them. They're not all sexual sadists, though sexual motivation is present in a significant proportion of cases. They're not all highly intelligent. The criminal genius archetype is fiction. IQ in documented serial killer populations clusters around average. And they're not all, in the clinical sense, psychopaths, though callous unemotional traits and a capacity for compartmentalization are consistently found. What is consistent across the research is a specific psychological architecture, like a fantasy life that precedes and significantly shapes the crimes, right? A cooling off period that is not inactivity, but preparation, a return to fantasy, a refinement of the next approach. A process of objectification of victims is not incidental, but foundational to the ability to kill repeatedly, and almost universally, a history. And that history almost always includes childhood trauma, often severe. Early exposure to violence or neglect, a developmental period characterized by social marginalization, powerlessness, and the construction of an elaborate internal world as compensation, animal cruelty, fire setting, bedwetting, the so-called McDonald triad. These appear with some frequency in early histories, though subsequent research has complicated their predictive value. The typologies developed by researchers like John Douglas and Robert Ressler, organized versus disorganized and mission-oriented versus hedonistic versus power-seeking, remain useful as frameworks, even though real cases routinely kind of blur those categories. And I want to say something about the cultural fascination with serial killers, because I think that's worth examining too. The documentaries, Netflix, the dramatizations, the podcasts, yes, including this one. I'm aware of the irony. There is something in human psychology that's kind of drawn to extreme cases as a way of trying to understand the outer limits of what people are capable of, right? That impulse is not inherently wrong. But the problem is when the fascination becomes entertainment at the expense of the victims, who become incidental to their own story. I try to hold that line. I don't always know if I succeed, but I'm trying. The victims of serial killers are not random, despite the mythology. Most serial killers have a type, not always in the superficial physical sense, but in terms of vulnerability. They select targets who are less likely to be immediately reported missing, less likely to be believed, maybe less connected to systems of protection, like sex workers and runaways and people in addiction, marginalized communities for sure. This is not coincidence, it's selection. And the fact that so many serial killer cases went undetected for so long is, in significant part, a story about whose disappearance society chooses to urgently investigate. I don't like having to say that, but again, it's a true thing. Mass murder. It's defined as the killing of 4 or more people in a single incident, a single location, and it is statistically rare. It is also, in terms of its psychological and social impact, vastly disproportionate to its frequency. The way we talk about it, the fear it generates, the policy debates it drives, all of this operates at a scale completely disconnected from the base rate. And I want to say that, not to minimize it, but to kind of put it in a context, right? The gap between the statistical reality and the cultural weight of mass murder is itself forensically significant. It tells us something about what these events do to a society that extends well beyond the immediate casualty count, right? The research on mass murderers, and this is literature I approach with considerable care because it's both politically charged and genuinely contested, identifies several consistent themes. So grievance, okay? The majority of mass murders are, in their own framing, acting in response to a perceived injustice, a wrong that was done to them, a world that failed to recognize their worth, a group that they hold responsible for their suffering. The grievance is almost always real in the sense that the person genuinely feels it. Of course. It's almost never proportionate to the response. And it almost always, on examination, the product of a deeply distorted cognitive framework rather than an objective assessment of events. There's also social failure and marginalization. So mass murderers, particularly in the American school and workplace shooting context, disproportionately show histories of social rejection, humiliation, and the experience of being invisible or dismissed. This does not mean that social rejection causes mass murder. It emphatically does not. The vast majority of socially rejected people never approach violence. But in combination with other factors like access to weapons, ideological frameworks that validate violence as a response, maybe mental health vulnerabilities, and the absence of protective factors, it is a consistent element of the profile, for sure. Now, leakage, this is the forensic term for the pre-attack communication of intent to friends, online, in diaries, manifesto documents, whatever. Research by threat assessment specialists consistently finds that in a significant proportion of mass attack cases, the perp communicated their intent to someone before the attack. The problem is not that there was no warning. The problem is that the warnings were not taken seriously, or they weren't reported, or they were reported to systems not equipped to act on them. Right? The leakage research is the one that sits with me the most heavily because it means these events are not, in many cases, truly unpredictable. They're failures of reporting and failures of intervention, and they're failures of systems that are supposed to catch exactly this kind of escalation and don't. And that's not really a fun thing to sit with either, as someone who is very, very familiar in this field, it shouldn't be comfortable. It should be a call to do better, I think. Now, there's also the role of ideology. So increasingly, the forensic literature on mass violence, particularly terrorism and ideologically motivated attacks, grapples with the role of ideological frameworks in providing both motivation and permission structure for extreme violence. So the ideology does not cause the violence in a simple linear sense. It just kind of provides a grievance with a target, and a target with a justification, and a justification with a community of validation. The individual who might have remained in a state of diffuse resentment finds in an ideological framework a story that makes sense of their suffering and a designated enemy to hold responsible, right? The internet's made this process significantly more efficient. What once required physical community, finding others who shared the grievance and finding ideological validation now requires only a search and a willingness to go down a particular rabbit hole. The radicalization pathways that used to take years can now take months. If that's a forensic reality the field's still catching up to. Now I'm going to talk about spree killers. Spree killing occupies the space between mass murder and serial killing. So multiple victims, multiple locations, no meaningful cooling off period. The perp is usually in a state of acute psychological crisis and frequently does not survive the event. So death by law enforcement or suicide is common. The spree killer profile differs from both the serial killer and the mass murderer in important ways. There is less premeditation of specific targets. So, they're not taking their time. They're just at random, whatever, going for it. There's more acute psychological disorganization, and the event is more likely to be precipitated by a specific triggering incident like a loss, a humiliation, a final straw that kind of breaks something that was already severely compromised. Now, what the research shows consistently is that spree killers are almost never operating from a position of psychological stability when the event occurs. So acute mental health crisis, maybe substance intoxication, perhaps an extreme emotional dysregulation event, they're all significantly overrepresented, which is not the same as saying that mental illness causes spree killing. It doesn't. The relationship is more complex, and the stigma attached to that claim causes serious harm to people with mental illness who are statistically far more likely to be victims of violence than the perpetrators of it. I said that in an earlier episode. But crisis in the context of an individual who's already on a concerning trajectory is a significant escalating factor. And I want to be careful here because I know this part of this episode will be the one that some people clip out of context, okay? So I want to say it clearly. The vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent. The vast majority of people in psychological crises are not violent. The relationship between mental illness and violence, when it exists, is almost always mediated by other factors like substance use, access to weapons, history of prior violence, social isolation, all those things. So mental illness alone is not a risk factor for violence toward others. It is, however, a significant risk factor for violence towards oneself. Okay? The difference there matters because I think it gets collapsed constantly in public discourse in ways that are damaging and inaccurate. Now, I want to bring this back to the thread that's kind of run through every episode of this series so far. The extreme end of the spectrum, the serial killer, the mass murderer, the spree killer, the perpetrator of intimate partner homicide, is not a separate category of human being, okay? It's the endpoint of pathways. Pathways shaped by biology, environment, by attachment, ideology, crisis, or the presence or absence of intervention at critical moments, right? That does not make what they did forgivable. Forensic understanding is not forgiveness at all. It's not even sympathy necessarily. It's just accuracy. It's just a fact. It's just a data point. Accuracy is what we need if we're going to do anything useful with any of this. The alternative, the monster myth, the bad seed narrative, the comforting fiction that dangerous people are visibly other is not just wrong, it's dangerous, and it lets us off the hook for systems that fail, and the warnings that go unheeded, and the help that arrives too late or not at all, right? Cases I've encountered in forensic work that disturb me most are not the ones where there was no warning. They are the ones where there were warnings, clearly, and not a damn thing happened. Where a system that should have caught something didn't, where someone said out loud that they were afraid and wasn't believed. And I think about those cases, and I think about them more than I probably should. And they're part of why I do this, the content, the courses, the podcast, all of it. Because, information changes outcomes. Not always and not reliably, but sometimes it does, right? And sometimes is enough of a reason for me. So tomorrow is the final episode of Dangerous Minds. Can we predict it? Can we stop it? I'm going to close the loop on the question that opened the series. Risk assessment, intervention, what the research actually says about prevention and what all of this, like everything that we've covered this week, means in practice for the people living with it. I don't know. I hope I get it right because it's, it has the most at stake, I think. Thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, production costs, or the time it takes me to research and develop these shows for you, the info is in the show notes. You can also rate, review, and share these episodes on your social media or with your friends. It all makes a difference to me, and I appreciate it. I will see you tomorrow.
That's Dangerous Minds Unbound Off Script for people with slightly concerning taste in podcasts. Unbound is free to listen to. Show notes have everything you need if you want to support the show or get in touch with Beth. Thanks for listening. Probably says something about you that you made it this far. We mean that as a compliment.